Hello and welcome back to the SameGame tutorial part 7, and let's just jump straight back into it, shall we? So in the last part of the tutorial we created this shift icons function, which is going to help us to shift icons around on the grid whenever a gap has been formed. Inside of this function we started on creating a for loop which is going to iterate through the icons list in the reversed order so that we can shift the icons in the correct way. What we didn't manage to do last time was to create a variable inside of this function which is going to contain the value of the current iteration of the for loop but in the reversed order. So let's make a new line, and then we're going to call the variable rIndex, which stands for reversed index. And then we're going to create a calculation which is going to give us the correct reversed index value. So we're going to start with a pair of brackets, and inside of here we're going to say grid size minus 1, and outside of that we're going to say minus I. So this will give us the value of 100 minus 1, which is 99, and then minus I, which will be dependent on the current iteration of the for loop. So this calculation will therefore give us the correct reversed index value. So since this for loop is helping us to shift icons downwards to fill in any empty gaps, we are going to want to create an if statement next, which is going to check if the current icon in the for loop has the value of none, and if it does, then we have identified an empty spot in the grid. The next thing we want to do after that is to make sure that we're filling this empty spot with an icon that resides above the empty spot. So we're going to want to create another for loop which is going to check upwards until we find an icon that we can move down. So let's go ahead and create the first if statement, and it is going to look like this. If icon is none and rIndex is more or equal to icons per row. And the reason why we are checking if the current reversed index variable value is more or equal to icons per row is to make sure that we're never trying to move an icon down into the first row of the grid, because we don't have any more icons above the first row. So if the rIndex value is more or equal to icons per row, then that means that we are only checking the rows underneath the first one. And inside of this if statement we are going to create another loop which is going to check upwards row by row until it finds an icon that it can move down into this empty spot of the grid. So to do that we are going to first create a variable which we are going to call rm, which stands for row multiplier, and we are going to set this to the value of 0 to start with. And then for the loop we are going to say while icons list rIndex minus brackets icons per row times row multiplier. And then outside of that we're going to say is none, like so. So now we have a while loop which is checking if the current empty grid cell in our grid has another empty grid cell in the row above. And as long as this condition is true, then the while loop will keep on looping. But then we also need one more condition which is going to check if this value right here is more or equal to icons per row, in order to prevent this loop from trying to check if there's an empty grid cell above the very first row of a grid. So we're going to write and then we can copy paste this piece of code right here, like so, and then we'll write is more or equal to icons per row, like so. So now that we have added all of the necessary conditions that we need for this while loop, we can go ahead and add some content to it. And this content is actually going to be quite simple, as it's only going to consist of one line of code, and it's going to look like this: rm plus equals 1. So that means as long as our while loop is equal to true, then we're going to get a progressively larger rm variable. But if the while loop was ever to return false, the Ren'Py engine would then continue on the next line of code, which is going to do something else. And now, by this point, the rm variable is going to have a specific value depending on how many iterations the while loop was able to do. So what does this row multiplier variable actually represent? Well, it represents the number of times that the while loop was able to traverse upwards through the different rows until it found an icon and not a non-value. So we can now use this variable in order to get to the icon that resides on this specific row in order to move it down to the gap that was found in the current iteration of the for loop. And to do that, we are first going to create an if statement, and this if statement is going to check if the value at this index position of the icons list is not equal to none. But why do we have to check that? Well, that is because we are going to try to access the icon that exists on this position to set its y attribute to a value that will move this icon down into the empty spot. But if we were to find a group of matches at the very first row of the grid and we click to delete these, then our function isn't going to be able to find any icons above this first row, and so we're going to get an index error, and trying to access the y attribute of this is going to generate a non-object value, and a non-object value does not have a y attribute. So to prevent that error, we are therefore going to write if icons list r index minus icons per row times rm is not none, like so. So now we can go ahead and move down the icon that exists on this position if it's not none. So we're going to copy this, and then we'll create a new line and paste it here, and then we're going to access its y attribute. So we're going to type dot y, and then we're going to say plus equals, so that we are moving it based on its current position. And then we're going to create a calculation which is going to give us the correct position for this icon. So we're going to write brackets icon size times rm, and then outside of that we're going to say plus another set of brackets icon padding times rm. So now that we have actually moved the icon sprite on the screen, we also want to make sure that we are reflecting these changes inside of the icons list by swapping the none value with the icon value. So to do that, we're going to create a new line, and then we're going to say icons list, and then inside of these square brackets we're going to give it the index value of r index, which is, if you remember, the position in the icons list where the empty grid cell was found. And then we're going to say equals to, and then we're going to give it this value, like so. So now we have made sure that the empty grid cell has the value of the icon that resides in one of the rows above. But now we also need to make sure that we are setting the icon that exists on this position that we just moved down into the empty spot to the value of none, so that we are truly swapping these two values. And to do that, we are going to copy this line of code, and then we're going to create a new line, and then we'll paste it. Now remove this extra indentation there, and then we're going to say equals to none, like so. And now there's one more thing that we need to do, and that is to update the index attribute value for the icon that we just moved down, so that it will represent the correct spot in the grid. So we'll create a new line, and then we'll say icons list r index, like so, and then we'll say dot index is equal to r index. So now we have all of the necessary code that we need in order to shift icons downwards to fill in empty gaps. However, now we also need to make sure that we are redrawing all of the icons so that these changes actually occur. So to do that, we'll create a few empty lines, and then we'll go into the correct indentation, and then we're going to say icons to refer to our sprite manager object, and then we'll say redraw, and then we'll add 0 instead of these brackets, like so. So now we can go ahead and launch the game to see if our code to shift icons downwards is working correctly. But remember to also save your changes before you do. So now that we are back inside of the game again, let's go ahead and delete some matches from the grid to see if any icons will be shifting downwards. And let's start with something relatively simple, such as this group right here. So if I click on one of these, a gap should be formed, and then these two icons should shift downwards to fill that gap. So let's go ahead and try that. And as we can see, that worked as intended. Now let's try something else, such as down here. And as we can see, that also worked as intended. Then let's try some more. And as we can see, it all seems to be working correctly and we're not getting any errors. So now we can go back into the code and see what else we can do. So now that we are back inside of the script file again, there's another important thing that we need to talk about, and that is in regards to saving and loading the game. Because this is a pretty complex subject to try to explain, I'm going to create a separate video in the future where I'm going to delve more in depth into this subject, but for now I'm going to try to make it simple. So the way that the Ren'Py engine works in saving Python variables is that it will only remember the changes that was made to these if the user has managed to reach the next checkpointed statement and chooses to save the game at this point or afterwards. And what is a checkpointed statement? Well, in our case, the last checkpointed statement that ran was this one down here inside of our setup icons label, where we have said call screen SameGame. So in the background of this statement inside of the Ren'Py engine, a checkpoint has been created, which means that the Python variables that we have created and changed since the game started and up until this checkpointed statement will be saved if the user chooses to save the game at this point or afterwards. But any changes that we have done to these variables after this statement has run is not going to be able to be saved by the Ren'Py engine because we don't have any more checkpointed statements after these changes has been done. So after this statement has run, the screen SameGame is being called, and all of this script and code inside of here runs and adds the grid cells and icons to the screen. Then, depending on what the user is doing with these icons, such as clicking to remove a group of matches from the grid, the delete matches function and the shift icons function is going to run and change some objects inside of the icons list to different values. But after these two functions has run, as I said before, we don't have any more checkpointed statements or interactions that runs that will allow the user to save these changes. But fortunately for us, there is a function inside of Ren'Py that we can use in order to save the changes before the next checkpointed statement runs. But before I'll tell you more about this function, I do want to mention one thing, and that is, even if we did have another checkpointed statement that would run after this delete matches function and shift icons function have run, we still wouldn't be able to save the changes that has happened to the icons list, and that is because we haven't actually changed what the icons list variable is referring to. We have only changed the items inside of the icons list in different ways, and this isn't considered as a savable change in the Ren'Py engine. But as I said, I will delve more into details about this subject in a later video. So this function that I was mentioning earlier is actually called retain after load, and this will allow us to be able to save the changes that has made to the icons list, regardless if it's now pointing to a new object or if we just have simply changed some of the objects that the list contains. So we're going to create a new line and we're going to say Ren'Py dot retain after load, like so. And then the next thing we should do is to actually select these two lines of code, and then we're going to move the indentation of these two lines to be the same as this for loop. So we're going to go back like so, and this is because we don't really need to run these two functions every time the for loop iterates. We only need to run it once after the for loop has finished. So now we could go ahead and launch the game to see how saving and loading is working. However, before we do that, let's actually go ahead and comment out this retain after load function call, just so that we can see how saving and loading is working with versus without it. So let's go ahead and save our changes and then launch the game. So here inside of the game, we are going to go ahead and delete a bunch of matches from the grid, and then we'll save the game and load it back up to see how it looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and delete a bunch of matches here, like so, and then I'll hit escape on the keyboard to get to the save menu, and then I'll save the game at this slot. And now we can go ahead and load the game back up again straight away. So go to the load menu, and here we can see after we loaded the game back up again, the shifting of the icons that occurred before we saved the game is not reflected in the loaded game. So now we'll go back to the code and uncomment our retain after load function call to see if it will work any differently. So let's go ahead and uncomment this function call, like so, and then we'll save. So now the shifting of the icons should be able to be reflected into the loaded game as well. So now that we are back, let's go ahead and do the same thing again. So we'll delete a bunch of matches, like so, and then we'll go ahead and save the game. So we can override this slot right here, and then we'll load it back up. And now we can see that the shifting of the icons that happened when we saved the game is also reflected into the loaded game. So now that we have that done, we are going to continue in the next part by adding some more code that is going to help us to shift icons from right to left to fill in any possible empty columns that we may get. So I thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.